All right, my friends. Today we're going to talk about a really interesting subject, simulation theory, and how it relates to spirituality and some of the ancient wisdom. Some of the questions that we are going to address is if we're in a simulation, who the heck created it? Okay. And of course, does the ancient wisdom teach simulation theory? Also, is the simulation theory compatible with a consensus belief reality? And if you're not familiar with that term, you can go ahead and look it up and we'll discuss it a little bit later too, also. And then last but not least, is it a conspiracy by some evil or benevolent God or some aliens or something like that? Some evil overlords? These are all the questions that are often asked about simulation theory. And so we're going to try to answer all of them if we can and get to the bottom of it. So buckle up. It's going to be a wild ride, my friends. So we'll see what some of the more prominent experts in this area have to say about it, like Professor Donald Hoffman, Peter Canova, and heck, even Elon Musk has weighed in on this, and I think he believes it as far as I can tell. So in this context, what the heck is simulation theory? Well, basically, it's a theory put forward by Nick Brahman. It basically says we're living in a computer-like simulation. So what is a simulation in this context? If you hear the word simulation and you immediately think of the movie The Matrix, well, you wouldn't be too far off. The theory originated from Professor Nick Bostrom back in, I believe, 2003, and it was posted in the Philosophical Quarterly Journal out of Oxford University. The basic premise is that we live in a computer-generated reality. The holodeck from Star Trek comes to mind here. It even goes so far as to say that we're all even constructs of this generated reality. So the Matrix really picks this theme up, that's for sure. And of course, this met with lots of opposition and skepticism, as anything that upsets the status quo usually does, at least in the beginning. Kind of reminds me of that saying of Gandhi. First they ignore you, then they laugh at you, then they fight you, and then you win. We may not be at the winning stage yet, but I think we'll get there eventually. With the advent of AR and VR, or augmented reality and virtual reality, it's not too far-fetched these days with the advances that they've made in those areas. Which brings us to our first question. Did the ancient wisdom actually teach simulation theory in some form or another? Perhaps the most oldest and famous simulation story is the allegory of Plato's cave, where he has a bunch of guys chained up in a cave and they can't move their heads and they can only see one wall, and there's a fire behind them casting their shadows on the cave, and there's people and puppets and things walking in between the fire and them, and all they can see is the shadows on the wall. And they believe this is their reality, and that's all there is. And they discuss it and get excited about it, just like we do our own reality here, because they think that's all there is. Is that wild or what? The kicker is that none of it's real. Then we have the Gnostic writings of the Nag Hammadi, such as the Gospel of Thomas, the Apocryphon of John, or the Tripartite Tractate. In seeing the material world as an illusion or a construct by a lesser divine being, and that it can be transcended once it's discovered. We also have Buddhism, Hinduism, and the Vedic scriptures, along with Kabbalah, all teaching something similar, that reality, or they called it Maya, is an illusion, and it's something to overcome or to be able to see through. The Vedas called it Lila, or a grand play, so to speak. Which brings us to the Christian scriptures where Jesus says, "My kingdom is not of this world. And in my Father's house are many mansions. I am in the Father is in me, and I am in you." Think about that one. Among others, of course. The Father being the source of all, signifying there's more than meets the eye when it comes to the material world. All of this corresponds to simulation theory and even quantum physics, which we'll get into a little bit later, in that the 3D material world is a 3D projection or a hologram, if you will. And it's projected from a greater source, and nothing is as we perceive it. Scholar and researcher Peter Canova has written a book called Quantum Spirituality on a topic that brings together ancient spiritual traditions in science and quantum physics. Here's what he has to say about it.
It aligns really well. In fact, I'd go so far as to say that ancient spiritual traditions, particularly the Gnostic spiritual traditions that I concentrate in, really read like a textbook for quantum physics and the creation of parallel universes. If you read the Gnostic texts, it describes a process whereby different levels of consciousness are projected outward. And these levels of consciousness essentially are dimensions. They're separate dimensions of existence vibrating at different frequencies. So this was described pretty thoroughly in the Gnostic texts, and it really really fits very well.
Peter kind of sums it up here, but he takes it a little bit further with parallel universes and multi dimensions. His book is a fascinating read. I haven't read it all, but I'm reading it now, and I actually started reading it as research for this video. So I'd recommend it. Okay, so how does science, and more specifically quantum physics, intersect with this whole idea? The way I understand it, it's based on quantum field theory and collapsing wave theory, starting with the double slit experiment. So if you're not familiar with this, you can look it up. There's a bunch of stuff on it. It's pretty amazing stuff. As I see it, based on the double slit experiment, underlying reality is a sea of energy in the form of waves and particles. The kicker is waves only turn into particles when there's an observer. In other words, a mind has to observe the wave before it collapses into a particle. This is how 3D reality is created. This is why you hear me say we create our own reality. Also, in doing this collectively, this is how we create what I call consensus belief realities. I believe it was William Bowman who coined that term, and he's an out of body explorer and researcher who's written a few books on them, and they're fascinating reads. I've read them, and he worked at the Monroe Institute as an instructor there for a period of time, of course, on out of body experiences and other things. So these consensus realities, they are a product of groupthink, okay? So it makes sense if you think about it. That's what's happening in our society. It happens on the other side too. So this actually fits nicely with the projection or hologram idea of our current 3D reality, or the simulation, if you will. We are individually and collectively projecting our thoughts into the quantum field and creating our 3D reality by collapsing the wave to create the world as we know it. How's that for mind blowing? Professor Donald Hoffman gives a great analogy that I think can really help us understand this. Let's listen to what he has to say.
That I think a metaphor is needed to help understand how it might be working. And the metaphor I like is the user interface on, the desktop interface on your computer. If you're writing an email and the icon for that email is blue and rectangular and in the middle of your screen, does that mean that the email itself, the file in your computer, is blue, rectangular, and in the middle of the computer? Well, of course not. Anybody who thought that misunderstands the point of the desktop interface. It's not there to show you the truth in this metaphor. The truth would be the circuits and the voltages and magnetic fields. All that complexity, most of us don't want to know about that. That's really nasty. If you had to toggle voltages to craft an email, your friends wouldn't hear from you. It's just too hard. So whatever, the purpose is to hide reality. Completely to hide reality, just like your desktop interface on your computer is there to hide the circuits. You don't want to know about the circuits. And yet it allows you to control the circuits, right? By using icons and dragging them and clicking and so forth. You can control the reality without knowing anything at all about it. And that's what evolution did. Three-dimensional space is your desktop. It's a three-dimensional desktop, not just a two-dimensional desktop. And the icons are three-dimensional, not just flat. They're what we call physical objects.
So this is a really good analogy. 3D reality is just a user interface to the underlying truth that we don't see. Is that wild or what? Dr. Hoffman has an excellent book called The Case Against Reality, and I highly recommend it. All right, so this brings us to the big question. If this is a simulation, who created it? And I'll give you a hint. We've already actually answered that question somewhat. Did you catch it? But before we address that directly, let's tackle the whole conspiracy theory that kind of ties in with how this is created. So, did some evil or benevolent overlords create the simulation, as some believe? Some of the Gnostic texts seem to insinuate that to some degree, although not necessarily evil. Some lesser divine being kind of made a mistake and created a imperfect copy of the true reality. And that's what we live in. How about the scriptures? Even right in the scriptures in Genesis, right in the very beginning, could be extrapolated to mean something like that. Since the word translated to God is Elohim, and it's actually plural, it should be translated as gods or deities. Okay? So it's actually a group of gods that created the simulation, so to speak. So this brings us back to my earlier hint. So who or what really created the simulation? Did you figure it out yet? So who or what really created the simulation or 3D hologram, if you will? Okay, here's the answer. Are you ready? Wait for it. We did. We created it. Does that seem like an oversimplification? Go back to the double slit experiment, the observer, wave particle. There has to be a mind that creates it. Think about it, my friends. But it really is that simple, my friends. And it fits with the ancient wisdom. As Peter Canova calls it, the master consciousness is the creator of all things. And we are all expressions of that master consciousness. And I guess you could say lesser expressions, but we're individual expressions of it. Or, as I like to say, we're unique expressions of the one, the source, so to speak. And we're projecting ourselves onto the quantum 3D screen or field, if you will, and creating this reality collectively and individually. Back to the consensus belief realities, groupthink, if you will. So, just like a computer screen, it's only creating what you're inputting into it. Okay? But there's an underlying reality that's making it all happen that you don't see, like Dr. Hoffman brought up. So it seems that modern science and or quantum physics is finally catching up with some of the concepts that the ancient wisdom has been preaching for millennia and that nowadays so many people think is woo woo. So this is a big subject, my friends, and I could probably do 3 more videos on it as I got into researching it. So now I'm reading a new book, and I've watched a bunch of these videos that I may not have watched before, and a lot of it I've known already, but I was kind of refreshing my memory on some stuff. So I'm curious for you to tell me what you think about it. If you agree with me or if you don't, like I said, it's a big subject. So I hope you enjoyed this. Peace out, my friends.